Welcome to the fourth in the elementary writing series, Just Write. So far through this series, you've been given information on the writing process, pre-writing, types of writing, and today's webinar will focus on editing, revising, and providing feedback. The roles and specifics of each area will be discussed, as well as some common misconceptions of these areas. There will be some concrete ideas for you to use in your classroom as well. But before we get started on the details, let's take a look again at the overview of the writing process that you saw in the first few webinars. Looking at an overview of the writing process from part 1, 2, and 3 of the webinar series, the writing process consists of 5 parts: pre-writing, writing, revising, editing, and publishing. We've discussed the first 2 parts, pre-writing and types of writing, in our previous webinars. Today we will focus on revising and editing, and even delve a little into publishing or sharing our work. Let's move on to the slide that shows the recursive and reciprocal writing process. I'd like you to think for a second about how that might look. This diagram is that clear example of the recursive nature of the writing process. Remember, too often the process is presented as a linear lockstep process, which really violates the very nature of writing. Reading and writing are reciprocal processes, each developing fluency in the other. Remember, this slide has something that has been added to the traditional writing process, the responding piece, which will align with our discussion today on providing feedback. So hopefully by now you feel comfortable with getting your students to put something down on paper in the form of a draft. An important piece to remember is that a draft is not the final product. One activity that might help you show your students the best way to think about the difference between a draft and a final written piece of work is this. Find a picture that your students really like. Print it in draft with low quality. Don't fluff it up. Just print it on the paper as it would come out, whether it's too small or too big. However it comes back on the paper is what you want to show your students. Let your students critique and give feedback on how they want that picture to look. Make it bigger, or do they want to make it darker? Do they want to add words to that picture? Then make the changes on your computer. I use my smartboard so they can see the processes I'm using, and I also do it as a think aloud. Now you gather feedback again before you print it. Is everyone satisfied? Is it what they want it to look like? If not, make those changes again. Then, after you've made all the revisions, print it at high quality. Could be a lot of ink, but it's worth it. And use very good paper. Show the students both of the papers, the draft and your final product. How did the revisions, editing, and feedback make the picture go from okay to wow? This visual can go a long way to helping students see their draft is a work in progress instead of a final piece of work. The revision and editing of the draft needs to pull all the writing together to make it better and stronger. Just like a house needs a good foundation, idea development through pre-writing is key to ensuring excellence in writing. As students become more confident in their abilities to pre-write, it does not have to be as formal, but it needs to take place. Organization, conventions, voice, word choice, and sentence fluency all have a crucial role in writing, and they need to be addressed and modeled for beginning writers. Remember to implement strategies such as think alouds to help model those for your students. So now let's get back into the basics of editing, revising, and a little bit about feedback. Oftentimes, teachers and students confuse revising and editing. Revising is improving the clarity and organization of a piece of writing while being true to that purpose of writing. When revising, a student should ask the following questions. Does my piece have a clear beginning, middle, and end? Does my piece have a strong beginning that hooks the reader? Does my piece have a strong ending that fits the focus? Are the ideas and actions connected to each other? Can your reader follow the piece logically from beginning to end? Is it complete? Does it feel finished? One tip to help when revising is to write each sentence separately. We want students to notice the length of each one. Count the words in each sentence if they have to. They should have some short sentences and some longer ones. If their sentences are all short, then writing is choppy. If the sentences are all long, the writing becomes monotonous. One other thing that could work with students is to have a friend read it into a tape recorder or a phone. just the way it is written, or use a computer program. An anchor chart like this one can serve as a visual reminder of the operations of revision. Writers revise to add specificity by adding details. They create clarity by deleting irrelevant or unnecessary information. Writers can move text around to improve the organization and flow of the writing and improve descriptions by substituting precise words. Let's look at the ARMS model of revising. A stands for add, where a student might add details, description, alive words. R is to remove. Remove those words and sentences that don't make sense. M stands for move. Move the words and sentences that might fit into another spot in the writing. And S is for substitute. Substitute those dead words to alive words or those boring words to exciting words. One thing to notice is the use of term alive words and dead words. That leads us to the power of words. Building vocabulary is going to be a big part of the last webinar of this series, but just know that the power of the right word, even in elementary school, one of the best ways to help students with word choice is through mentor text and quality literature. Remember, this will need scaffolding for younger students. This will be discussed more thoroughly in the next webinar, but a word of caution. Big words and the just right word are not the same thing, especially if students are unclear of the meaning. Word choice is important, but is more meaningful when seen in authentic text. This now leads us back to another important point, the difference between revising and editing. This chart clearly shows the difference in revising and editing. The acronyms ARMS and CUPS make it easier for students to remember what to do during the writing process, especially with our younger students. We already went over what ARMS means. Let's look at what CUPS means. CUPS for editing stands for C, capitalize. Ensure that when you're editing, you're capitalizing names, places, titles, months, all the things that need a capital letter. U is for usage. Check that your nouns and verbs are used correctly. P is for punctuation. Do you have your periods at the end, your quotes, your commas, semicolons, apostrophes? Is everything in there correctly? And the S is for spelling. Check all your words. Look for homophones. Use a dictionary to ensure that you have the correct spelling. These are by no means the only two ways, but be sure to find ways to help students understand the difference between revising and editing. When deciding what to use, there are a few questions to ask. What is important to you about revision? What are your non-negotiables? Think about it. Many middle and high school teachers and even some college professors would love for every student to be able to have a complete sentence that was well written and started with a capital letter and also had the correct ending punctuation. But don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. The revision piece, that's the forest, is here to make sure the work is well written, and the editing piece, the trees, ensures that what is written is coherent and has minimal errors to not interrupt the passage. Sometimes revision gets lost in a time crunch, but it is a really important piece that needs to be intentionally taught. Both pieces are impactful. And sometimes it's easier for teachers to edit because it's more cut and dried, while sometimes revision can feel subjective. Editing involves proofreading and correcting errors in grammar and mechanics. One tip to share with students is to get some distance from the text. It's hard to edit or proofread a paper that you've just finished writing. It's still too familiar and you tend to skip over a lot of errors. Another tip that seems to work, especially well for my students, was to read the writing backwards. Start at the end and read to the beginning. There is abundant research to support the instruction of conventions through the context of reading and writing. Peer editing is a strategy that gives the writing fresh eyes. By exchanging papers with a peer, students can get a better sense of what rough drafts generally look like and spot errors in their own writing. It may seem intimidating, especially for students who aren't confident about their writing, but the good news is that peer editing helps everyone, the writer and the editors alike. Some teachers fear assigning writing because they think they have to grade and respond to everything. That is just not true. If the writing is informal, a journal entry, or a bit of free writing, it really would be a waste of time to focus on grammar. Sometimes students learn simply from writing itself, whether or not the teacher even responds to their work. It's important to distinguish two very different goals for writing. There is writing to demonstrate learning, and there is the less commonly used writing for learning. These different kinds of writing require different kinds of responses. During sharing time, students read from their writing, share what they are working on and what they want to work on. It's also a time when students share their process, where their ideas came from, what their purpose is for writing, and how they use strategies taught in focus lessons in their writing. It is making their process visible. Share time is just as important to writing workshop as the focus lesson and independent writing times. Share time is another opportunity to teach and to assess. Also, coming back together as a whole group after writing builds classroom community and provides a sense of closure for the students. So now let's turn our attention to feedback for a second. It can singularly be one of the most important tools for turning a reluctant writer into a confident writer. Writing can be very personal, and it is very important to remember that young writers will need not only constructive feedback, but also encouragement. Think back to your own experience as a learner. What types of responses or feedback have you received on your writing? When you were in school, did you revise your text and write second or third drafts, or did you only correct the surface mistakes? How did your teacher mark the mistakes? Did they suggest solutions? What kind of feedback helped you improve your writing, and what was not helpful? My own experience in school was to get a piece of writing back with only a grade or with editing marks showing me all of my errors in content and conventions. This was always at the end of the writing process. No response or feedback was given during the process. Responding while the writing is in process cuts down on the amount of response needed at the end of the task when teachers are faced with a whole class set of papers to assess or evaluate. One way of providing response is having students read their paper or a portion of it aloud to the class, to you, or even to a small group. Students begin to pick up what's confusing as well as understand how others will respond to their piece. You can also ask students to take their finished draft and reread each paragraph. They should look for the main idea of the paragraph, consider how the paragraphs flow, and write their own responses in the margins. These comments can then become a basis for revision. When responding to student writing, teachers can take on different basic roles and determine their feedback accordingly. As the audience, the teacher can respond personally and directly by showing surprise, asking questions to clarify certain points, and adding personal views. Also, as part of the audience, the teacher responds to the student's ideas, feelings, and experiences and communicates his or her reactions to the writer. As assistants, teachers help students improve their text by giving specific feedback. In this role, the teacher sees the text as a work in progress and helps students strengthen their writing skills. And finally, as evaluators, teachers look at the piece of writing as a finished product. They comment on the learner's performance in content, organization, grammar, and vocabulary. Conferencing is at the heart of helping students develop support and elaboration in their writing. Students can learn to revise by asking questions about their writing and the writing of others during conferences with the teacher and with peers. Teachers can first model how to ask questions to add more information, from general requests to tell me more, to more specific who, what, where, when, why, and how questions. Once students have learned to ask questions about their own writing, they can learn to add information and delete irrelevant details that might weaken the writing and to make details more specific and concrete. At first, it may be difficult to know what to say when conferencing with a student writer. Starting with these questions is a good start. What are you working on? You want students to know that you expect them to be working on something. Can you read me some of what you've written? Even if you know exactly what they've written, ask them to read it back to you. This is more for their benefit than for yours. One of the best habits we can help young writers develop is the habit of reading over their own work. How is your writing coming along? Is there anything I can help you with? Try to find out if they have a specific problem that you can help them with. And what are you going to do next? This is the best question of all because it focuses the student's attention on what they need to do next, something that many beginning writers don't give much thought to. Remember, The key to a good teacher-student conference is that you are teaching the student one writing strategy or technique, not fixing or editing the student's writing. Peer conferencing is not easy for learners at first, and it must be introduced and practiced. The first peer comments may be very general. Students who have received helpful feedback from their teacher will easily learn this skill by imitating their teacher's feedback behavior. Teach peer conferencing as an essential part of the writing process. Define the role of the peer as that of a reader, not an evaluator. Describe peer conferences as an opportunity for students to learn how to write for an audience. Teach students what constructive feedback means. That's providing feedback about areas that need improvement without criticizing the person. Feedback should be done in a kind way. Show examples of vague feedback, such as "this should be more interesting," and show them examples of clear feedback. A description of the main character would help me to imagine him or her better. And have students point out which kind of feedback is most useful. During peer conferences, the writer should read their own work, direct the listener to specific parts for feedback, listen to the peer's responses without interrupting, and be open to the possibility of revisions. The responder should listen and not interrupt the writer's reading. Give full attention to the writer through eye contact and body language. Respond to the piece as a whole, beginning with the strong points, and focus on sentence structure, word choice, description, and organization. Writing feedback is certainly one of the most challenging jobs of a writing teacher. Feedback can easily be misunderstood and hurt a learner's feelings. Try to think about why students might be struggling with a particular task. Review the comments you gave students last time around and identify how they have improved, or identify a particular issue they continue to struggle with. Do not mark every error you see. This takes too much time and it overwhelms the students. Save most of your feedback for an end comment. Tie your feedback to the larger goals and set goals for your students and monitor their achievement of these goals. You should use the students' own papers to demonstrate that they know how to do something they are not doing in other places in their writings. Make the most out of your time devoted to feedback. Provide feedback to the class as a whole by identifying trends. Name what your entire class is doing well and what they need to continue to emphasize using the feedback for the next assignment. A teacher isn't the only one who can assess a writing sample. Students can assess their own writing by working in pairs or small groups. Small groups of children can meet and conference about one piece, or each student can bring a piece to exchange and have reviewed. As with any good assessment, the purpose should align with the procedure. Writing assessment is useful primarily as a means of improving teaching and learning. The primary purpose of an assessment should determine its design, its implementation, and use of its results. When you see a grammar mistake or a spelling error, simply put a small X next to it. Let your students problem solve what needs to be corrected. This will cut back your time and help students grow as writers and assess their own work. Using a rubric to assess students' writing is a great way to see exactly what students are grasping and what they're struggling with. What makes rubrics efficient is that teachers can circle and add notes to each category. Rubrics can help you clarify your criteria for yourself as well as your students and keep you focused during the grading process. Provide your students with the grading rubric before they begin writing. A rubric is simply a scoring tool that outlines important criteria, and there are two basic types of rubrics. The first is the analytics rubric. An analytics rubric breaks down the various criteria into separate components and often assigns some sort of individual value or weight to each element. Analytical scoring calls for teachers to provide feedback on each of the noted criteria for the writing task. The criteria is determined by the type of writing. These can be useful for precise and fair assessments. The second type of rubric is the holistic rubric. Holistic rubrics describe the qualities of an assignment at various levels of expertise, providing an overall judgment of the piece. A holistic rubric consists of a single scale with all criteria to be included in the evaluation being considered altogether. With a holistic rubric, the rater assigns a single score, usually a 1 to 4 or 1 to 6 point scale. It's based on an overall judgment of the student work. These can be especially useful for rapid grading. There are many free rubrics on the web for you to use based on the type of writing assessment you are looking for. All of the parts of the writing process have an important role in the success of your students. One of the most important things you can do is create a culture in your classroom that shows students that constructive feedback can be positive, but also can correct mistakes to make it better. Writing is personal, but also can be a predictor of success for students. As we begin to focus on real-world outcomes, think of the implications of having a cover letter for a job that is well written rather than full of errors. What about having to write a letter to a teacher, a parent, a coworker, or someone in the community? The editing and revising skills you are teaching in elementary may seem painful at times to both you and the students, but you are helping set them for future success. Keep your eye on the prize. Writing is such an important skill in school as well because it permeates every subject area. The final webinar of our series will deal with vocabulary and writing across subject areas and disciplines. Remember, the goal is to build competent and confident writers through relevant, rigorous, and realistic writing tasks.